Shocker era comes from a long line of Shocker paintball guns. First there was the shoebox Shocker, and then now we have the toothpaste-sized Shocker era. But can the era lead us into a new reign of Shocker, or is it just more of the same? To find out, we're going to break the era down into 5 different categories. First, we're going to talk about ergonomics, build quality will be next, and then just how the thing shoots, reliability, and user friendliness. When the Shocker was re-released with the RSX about 8 years ago, it took on a very small form. The body, the foregrip, and that trigger frame were both very small, which was perfect for some people, but I think most people thought the gun was a bit too small. That's why Shockers have been getting bigger and bigger. It's slight, but they've definitely grown a little bit over the versions. And the same thing can be said about the era. And to try to get it into more people's hands, the era's made some big changes. But is it going to work? The era now has a foregrip that's 30% larger than the amp. And when I first saw these things, I just didn't believe it. It still looks so small, and it's been, a few months since I've actually held an amp in my hands. But then I actually got to hold the amp and the era back to back, and it is ridiculous how much bigger the era foregrip actually feels in your hand. But for me, it's still a little bit too small. I want a little bit larger foregrip. When we compare it to the 180R foregrip, these lined up, you can really just kind of see how much bigger the 180R foregrip is, even when the era's been 30% increased in size. The foregrip's still about the same shape, maybe a little bit more square. The grips are definitely harder though, and not as rubbery as the previous, but it still has far better grip than just a regular aluminum foregrip. And they're also very hard to remove. The previous rubber grip just kind of slid off and there was nothing really holding it in place. These now have a notch on the side that makes it very hard to remove. I actually tried and I just couldn't get the thing off. I felt like I could pry it off by, sticking some tools in places, but I really didn't want to break anything, so, I just left it on. The trigger frame has about the same feel, but it's about a 1/4 inch taller, letting you get a little bit lower grip on the frame. And they've also reduced the size of the on-off knob, that also lets you hold the frame a little bit lower. But for anyone who's held the Shocker amp or the XLS, it should feel very similar. The trigger's probably the biggest change to that frame area. Now it has this, double trigger kind of blade deuce trigger. I really like these styles. I just feel like I can actually get like a good shot and a good grip when they actually have this like kind of double hump in the middle of them. So I really like the new trigger. It also feels a lot more crisper and solid when you're just pulling the trigger. That's because in the grip frame now, that trigger stops on a dedicated spot in the frame. So it doesn't feel as mushy or as soft. It's gonna feel much more crisp and a premium feel, kind of like you'd expect when it's a $1,000 gun. And I think all these changes to the ergonomics, right, making that foregrip bigger and then kind of changing the trigger around, drastically helps. I really did not like the way the amp felt, but making that foregrip bigger for myself, I like a lot. It's just I can get a better grip on the front of the gun. And the trigger is definitely more satisfying and just feels a lot nicer. And the overall quality on the era is still going to be on par with the previous guns. It's not the best, and I like to maybe think about these like phones, right? We could think about the Shockers being Samsung phones, where they're not the greatest, but they're still really good. And then maybe Planet Eclipse is like Apple. They're certainly made the best and have the highest build quality. The Planet Eclipse guns, the screws just go in better, the grips line up better, pieces just go together better, and they're just kind of nicer. But for the most part, that doesn't really matter. I think it matters that we're getting, high quality products that we like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the era performs worse because it's not built a little bit better. I think that sometimes that can be the case, but there's certainly some things in the era that make it a little bit nicer that they've changed, but I'll actually touch on those in a little bit. So ergonomically, it's about the same. It's a little bit different, but still a Shocker, and the era still shoots like a Shocker as well, with a few changes, mainly in the way of being a little bit easier on paint. Shocker era, I just have some really, really, really fragile paintballs. The Dynasty Banana Fill, or Banana Scent, I should say. Whoop, that one ricocheted. That one broke. That one broke. It's super, super, super brittle. So I just want to see if this gun will shoot it. I've not tried to shoot really brittle paint yet, so We're gonna see if it works or not. All right, I'm gonna shoot. All right, I mean, there's no question, this paint's like super brittle. As I'm trying to show, it doesn't really work. Ugh. All right, that's good. If you want to buy yourself a Shocker Era, make sure and use the links in the description. They go to bfpgear.com, the best paintball store on the internet, and it helps support the channel. One of the main issues with the amp was ball rollback. So you could literally, the paintball would go in and roll back a little bit. This could cause eye issues, and it could also cause like the balls to stack unevenly, and you could like clip a paintball and end up chopping a ball in your gun and just breaking paint. So to get rid of that rollback, the Era has redesigned their cone, and you can see that cone's quite a bit longer, really making it impossible for paint to roll back. So it just kind of stops at the tip of that cone rather than rolling back into the bolt. They've also added porting to the bottom of the bolt. This helps slow the bolt down in the initial movement, so it's a little bit slower when it gets started. This will help reduce breaking paint just because it's going to hit the paintball a little bit softer when the gun's shooting. And there's also a few other areas they've changed to make the bolt higher flow. Higher flow generally means a softer shot and then easier on paint. And then in my rigorous testing, that's what I found out. With all those changes though, the Era doesn't really shoot all that much different than the amp. Maybe it's a little bit quieter, maybe a little bit less kicky, but it's not really that noticeable. It's kind of probably what you'd expect. I think it shoots very well, and it's really kind of probably on par with the 170R from Planet Eclipse, but I really think that the 180R and that DSR Plus, kind of both at this $1,000 price, the same as the Era, are shooting a little bit better. They're quieter and they definitely kick less. I mean, for sure, the DSR Plus is crazy, it's like, I don't know. Something I never really investigated on the amp or the TM40 was moving the O-ring on the can to the rear. And with the Era, they've added this additional O-ring groove that kind of makes it more obvious that you can move that O-ring around. Moving that O-ring to that back position increases the airflow by 80%. Yes, 80%. And you can see when you move that O-ring, it kind of exposes these holes under there, so it's just allowing more air to come out. The main reason you'd want to move that O-ring is if you're playing in like really, really cold weather. The grease doesn't really work that well and it's really cold. It just kind of like thickens up and doesn't work the greatest. So if you're going to play in really cold weather, moving that O-ring back can help overcome friction a bit. And I mean cold, like 30 degrees or something, not like, 55 or... It's got to be like cold. All right, so we're going to test the bolt out on this thing. There is that O-ring that you can actually swap around on the front of the bolt to add 80% airflow. So we're going to try that out and just, see what the difference is. So right now we're radared at 280. That's a 293, 287, 291. Okay, we'll swap around that O-ring now and see if we can see a difference. Okay, bolts back in, O-rings moved, aired up, guns on. We'll take a few shots so we can test the velocity again. 281, 286, 293, 288. So it's about the same thing, and this paint is not the greatest either, we'll say in there. Need a little bit of paintballs. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it right away, it definitely sounds quieter. I feel like doesn't kick as much too, actually. Huh. Yeah, it definitely feels a little different. I guess we'll go back inside and talk about it more. And I was kind of surprised by this thing, right? Most of the time on these guns, when they have like things that like make them perform different or something by just moving an O-ring or, turning something, I don't really notice all that much of a difference. But moving the O-ring on the Era, it really did make a difference. It thought it kicked less, it felt quieter, and I was, kind of surprised. You could play with that O-ring in that like back position all the time and play with that extra airflow, but you're probably going to get pretty bad air efficiency. And Shocker C are going to get about 11 pods on a 6845, which is pretty good. I mean, that's kind of, on par. It's about average. But if you left that O-ring back, you're probably looking at like 6 or 7. So kind of Shocker SFT, you could go back 20 years and get terrible air efficiency. I might just leave it in that back position. I shoot like 3 pods max. If you've got an Era, kind of mess with it and find out what you like. Reliability for a very long time was a problem with paintball guns, and the Shockers were leading the way. I hated my Shocker SFT and NXT. They always had problems. I mean, something was really going wrong every single weekend. And then 10 years after that NXT was released, we got the Shocker RSX. And it was, it was definitely better than the NXT, but it was not the most reliable. Then we got the XLS, which was better. Then we got the AMP, and it's been much, much better, and really, I think, kind of on par with the guns from Die and Planet Eclipse. Really, it's thanks to its bolt that looks suspiciously like the Gamma Core. But thankfully, we're probably going to see similar reliability to the Era because it also kind of has just the same bolt as the AMP, just a little updated. One thing that's not going to help reliability, though, is shipping broken guns. And my Era had 2 problems out of the box. First, before I ever used the thing, when I was filming B-roll and kind of removing the solenoid, the wire just literally popped out. I mean, it was barely in there. It felt like there was maybe 2 millimeters of wire in this plug. But thankfully, I know how to fix these things, and it really wasn't a big deal. I was able to strip the wire and get it back in there. And ever since then, it's been solid and holding fine. But there was only 2 millimeters of wire. There's got to be just more wire in there. And I got to make sure the thing works, right? We just put a new wire in the solenoid, so I screw a tank on. Gun cycle's fine, but then I'm like, wait a minute. It's definitely leaking from the grip frame. And the gun's brand new, so I don't know. I've never shot it. We've never put paint through it, nothing. I mean, it's literally brand new. So I changed the solenoid manifold O-rings, all of them on the outside, and just put the gun back together, and no leak. So randomly, I think that like the solenoid manifold O-rings were just bad. Like there was just like a cut or a nick in one of them. Replaced it, rock solid. And I don't think these problems were like insane. It's not like, they sent me like something bent or like insane problem. I was able to fix them in a few minutes, but I'm not average paintball player, right? I don't think that most customers are going to buy these guns brand new and then want to go home and like, disassemble the solenoid. That's kind of crazy. But I don't think it's like an issue, right? You're not going to like see a lot of these guns ship like that. It's not really been a problem in the past for them. This was a gun from the very first batch. And we've known of problems from guns from first batches before, right? The CS3, when I got it for review, had a problem because it was from the very first batch. And it was also another really easy fix. And I don't think that this Era will have problems like that from here on out, right? I think it's perfectly fine. Just kind of like this CS3. So even though I got one that was a little weird, I wouldn't expect to continue to see that. That'd probably be even weirder. There's no question that the DLX guns, being Shockers and Luxes, have some of the most user-friendly features on the planet universe. The Era has kind of what you'd expect: a lever feed neck, toolless bolt, the on-off ASA, an OLED screen, but it also has some stuff that the AMP had before it, like toolless solenoid, which is kind of nice, but I don't really like it. I feel like this tool stuff is awesome for removing stuff you remove a lot, like your hopper, tank, or even your bolt, but I'm not someone who's removing my solenoid all that often, unless it leaked, but normally I'm not. There is one reason you might want to remove that solenoid, though. If you're switching back and forth between mechanical and electronic, Shocker will be selling a mechanical frame for the Era, but as of right now, it's not out. That solenoid removal works the exact same way as the AMP. And, it's toolless, which is cool. I mean, some people kind of like that toolless thing. And it feels really secure when it's in there, right? When it's all flipped up and it's solenoid's in there, it feels really solid and it doesn't feel loose. It feels like it's, screwed down like a typical solenoid. But when it's out of there, I don't really like it. These little steel pieces feel just kind of flimsy and I feel like I'm going to bend it or break it. You have to line up this plastic clip on the front and it just kind of pops off when you're putting it on sometimes. I just kind of wish they'd include other things that were toolless, right? Like I'd like to see toolless eye covers, maybe toolless grips. You know, the competition's doing it with the 180R and DSR, so I'd kind of like to see that with the Era. Paintball Ruined My Life is supported on Patreon by people like these. And if you want to check out that entire shooting video with the bolt test in there, head over to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can get ad-free videos, you get early access to videos, and exclusive content like that Shocker Era shooting video. There is a rumor, though, that they're going to be selling toolless eye covers, though, maybe as an upgrade. I don't know, like 50 or 60 bucks you could get toolless eye covers. Maybe they'd be similar to the Luxe ones. I don't know, we're going to have to wait. And when you get that solenoid back on, it's going to be a little bit easier to install that trigger frame. So previously, the amp, the trigger frame kind of halfway slotted into the body, and now the Era, it slots all the way in, so it kind of goes into the body a little bit. This makes it a little bit easier to align that frame, and it also makes it way harder for like debris or water to get in there. Slotting the frame also helps address one major problem with the amp. The amp, if you really torqued and like kind of held onto that front foregrip a lot, you could kind of actually bend the frame down a little bit, causing the eye board to malfunction, and then also possibly creating a leak in between the trigger frame and the body. So slotting that trigger frame into the body all the way just helps it be a little bit more rigid and a little bit more secure feeling. But to really get rid of that completely, they've added these new plugs that are double-sided O-rings. Previously, this spot had a Loctited plug, so having these plugs be able to move around a little bit makes it so if potentially there is that gap in between the body and the trigger frame, it's not going to leak anymore. And they've also added that plug to the bottom of the frame right where that on-off ASA matches up. So if for some reason the ASA gets really loose, you're still going to have quite a bit of room in there that's going to seal up fine. Whereas previously the ASA just kind of flat mounted to the bottom of that trigger frame. So these should help quite a bit if stuff gets loose or whatever. It's just going to make it a lot harder for those like air contact points or whatever we're calling it to leak like they would on the previous guns. The Era is not surprisingly a wild departure from a Shocker. It's, still a Shocker. It has a very similar bolt to the amp, has the same electronics, the eyes are pretty much exactly the same, it uses the same style ball detents, but there's certainly some welcome upgrades. Like I like the upgrades to the bolt, how it can handle fragile paint better. I really prefer the ergonomic upgrades. I really like that foregrip. The trigger is great. And then having those air transfer plugs is an excellent improvement. We're not going to have as many reliability problems. And at $1,000, this gun has some very steep competition. You can get the DSR Plus for the exact same price, or the 180R from Eclipse for $1,100. And honestly, I would probably go with both of those options first. I think that I'm going to the 180R from Eclipse just because I trust that company and I know the reliability is going to be there, right? All their guns are reliable. And then I think I'd even go with the DSR. I think the DSR Plus shoots better for sure. The DSR Plus has like no kick and is very quiet. It shoots very well. And I even trust the reliability of the DSR Plus over the Era, which is crazy because I don't really like the die guns that much. But the DSR has been fantastic. So I think that in that price, you've got some very stiff competition with that Shocker Era. Make your choice.